Welcome to Diabetes Primetime, everybody. Tonight we are talking with diabetes psychologist Susan Guzman about how to manage the things about diabetes that drive us crazy. You won't want to miss this. Stay tuned. Susan, it is such a privilege to get to talk with you today. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
So you've really dedicated your life to helping people with diabetes manage the unique challenges that come with diabetes. So tell us what you love about being a diabetes psychologist. And folks, as we're talking, I want you to tell us in the comments, what about diabetes makes you particularly frustrated? I'm hoping that we'll be able to address a lot of those things in this show. So Susan, tell us all about your work.
Well, why I love being a diabetes psychologist is really when I can help somebody make a change or have a better relationship with their diabetes. As a psychologist, it's so rewarding because I can help someone not only change how they feel about diabetes, but perhaps make changes that help change the course of their lives. And it's very, very rewarding.
No, absolutely, because we don't realize sometimes how much our health impacts our lives. So you're really helping people work through the issues that have big downstream implications for their health and their life.
Absolutely, and when I got started on accident as a diabetes psychologist, and so the other part that I really love is that it's such an unaddressed problem, and so that when I'm able to bring knowledge and awareness and a message of hope to people with diabetes, it's oftentimes the first time they've heard it, and so that's sad, but as a psychologist that's able to focus in that area, it's actually also very rewarding.
Absolutely. All right, folks, before we get too far along, it is time for trivia. Tonight's trivia question is sponsored by Arcray, and if you answer tonight's question, you will be entered to win our guide to low-carb snacks. So our trivia question tonight is, true or false, dogs and cats can get diabetes? Is that true or false? Can dogs and cats get diabetes? Leave the answer for us in the comments, and just for answering, regardless of whether you're right or not, you will receive our guides to snacks that are lower in carbs and high in energy. You definitely want to answer this question and get that awesome guide. Trivia tonight is brought to you by Arcray. As your diabetes health ally, Arcray, the makers of the GlucoCard, help make diabetes management easy and affordable. Visit arcrayusa.com/cost to receive a free blood glucose monitor along with wellness materials to help simplify your diabetes management. All right, Susan, we asked in our Facebook group, what are the things about diabetes that are really frustrating? And I would say the number one thing we heard was that the thing that drives people crazy about diabetes is a lot of times you feel like you've done everything right and it's not reflected in the numbers. Robin says she hates the way the numbers jump so much when you thought you did so good. What would you say to people who feel like their hard work doesn't always pay off?
Well, firstly, I'd say you're not alone. That's the number one thing I hear about too. When you feel like your efforts aren't worth the work and diabetes doesn't follow the rules, that is the number one predictor really of burnout. When you feel like what you're doing doesn't matter, why would you bother?
Right.
And so helping figure out what the barriers are and looking at individualized solutions is really where you go with that. But that 75% of people with diabetes will at least report having mild struggle with that feeling of unpredictable numbers and feeling discouraged when you see something that you can't explain.
So based on that, I mean, I think the logical next question is, how can we stay motivated, to keep doing the things that we know are going to help us be healthy in the long run when sometimes in the short run we're not seeing the payoff?
Yeah, I think that a lot of times keeping your eye on sort of the bigger prize, that why are you bothering? Because I think the individual numbers can really make people feel like they're going to go crazy. But
yes,
really focusing on larger, like an individual high blood glucose numbers is not causing long-term damage.
Right.
And even though when you look at that individual number, it can become a judgment. So instead of saying 220, for example, you're in your mind, you're saying you blew it. Or what
right.
did you do wrong?
Right.
And so it becomes a judgment instead of just information for taking action.
Yes.
And people have had a lot of help getting to that place because there is so much judgment in diabetes. But, focusing on sort of for at the new metric is really being, referred to as the time in range. And that's like, how often your numbers are in target range. Um, and or also like looking at A1C. So rather than individual numbers, is your A1C in a safe place? And looking at sort of larger scale numbers instead of getting driven crazy by individual ones.
Okay, so I hear two really good pieces of advice there. One, recognizing that every number is just information. It's not good or bad. It's one of the reasons why we talk about checking blood sugar rather than testing blood sugar, because it's not a test. But two, also recognizing, a single number is not the end of the world. And, one of my favorite videos of our endocrinologist, Rich Jackson, he talks about individual glucose numbers you see on your meter aren't a big deal. What you want to do, as you just said, is focus on making sure your A1C is in a safe place. And if it is, and you're not having lows, you are doing awesome.
Right. And I think that, also thinking about the idea of safer, because it's what's discouraging for people who don't have their diabetes at target is like, for example, someone might start with an A1C of 11%, and then they work really hard and their A1C is a 9%. Now, in terms of risk reduction, that's huge.
Right.
However, when they go to get feedback from their healthcare professional, they may not hear "great job." They might hear, "that's still high, and you're not near target, and that's unsafe, and you have uncontrolled diabetes," and all these messages that don't recognize
all the hard work. Yeah,
or safer.
Yes.
Even if a 9 is the best you can do, that's safer than an 11. And what we've learned from a lot of these follow-up studies for people who've had diabetes a long time is that you don't have to be perfect to have well-managed diabetes. And in fact,
trying to get to perfect may sabotage you and make you just burned out and frustrated altogether.
Right. And there really isn't such a thing as perfect diabetes. So,
very good point. Yeah. So I know another thing that's frustrating to people is something that Cindy described. She says, I can do the exact same thing twice in a row and get different results on my meter. Val says the way the numbers go up and down drives her crazy. So what would you say to someone who's kind of frustrated with this other aspect of the numbers, that it is just so variable?
Well, I mean, again, what that means is you have diabetes. And that's when somebody described the experience of having diabetes as having a manual transmission pancreas. And
I've never heard that. That's fantastic.
And unfortunately, we don't have the tools yet to completely mimic, a healthy pancreas.
Right.
And so having blood sugars that go up and down, that just simply means you have diabetes. And what's really interesting now that people who don't have diabetes are wearing continuous glucose monitors just to see what normal glucose functioning looks like, we're learning that all people have a lot of fluctuations in their blood glucose levels. And so having more of those when you have diabetes is not really a symptom that you've failed. It's just, you have that manual transmission pancreas, and you have to do the best you can.
Do the best you can without blaming yourself or feeling judgment. All right, so speaking of blame, Vicki left a comment for us in our Facebook group that I think a lot of people can relate to. She says the thing about diabetes that's toughest for her, and she says, is, quote, the feeling that it's my fault, that when I was told I had prediabetes that I should have watched it. Man, that is so tough. So what should people who feel like diabetes is their fault know?
Well, combating the stigma of diabetes and fighting messages of blame and shame is a passion project of mine. And so feeling like you brought it on yourself, or that you caused your own diabetes, is a very common misconception. And I can see how one could easily come to that conclusion when you've been told you have prediabetes. Now, prediabetes isn't a diagnosis, it's a state. And so what it's saying is that it looks like you have the genes for type 2 diabetes, and now's the time to take action to keep from tipping over. Now, diabetes is not a choice. And if changing weight and your eating behavior and your physical activity and all of the things that increase your risk for crossing over into actually having diabetes when you know you have the genes. If it was that easy, nobody would get it. And there would be no such thing as an obesity epidemic, or we wouldn't have to be talking about so much about changing eating behaviors.
It's
And so
hard, is the
it's
reality.
hard. And the bottom line is diabetes is not a choice. And I think that fighting messages of blame and shame is very important. And unfortunately, it's everywhere in our culture. The stigma of diabetes is highly prevalent. That people think that diabetes is a self-inflicted disease that's caused by some of the cardinal sins like gluttony and laziness um, and not caring about one's health, and that's just simply not true.
That in fact, we have a lot of evidence that that is completely false, that genetics plays a huge role, age plays a huge role. As we get older,
Right.
diabetes is increasing just because of that. I'm so glad to hear you as a healthcare professional just debunk that thoroughly.
Yes, and really, unfortunately, the message is that very well intentioned about preventing diabetes. That there are actions you can take to help reduce your risk. Some people, and many people, in fact, will not be able to do that.
That's
And so to come to the conclusion that you gave it to yourself, I understand how that seems to be what our messaging is, but knowing that you have risks and that you weren't unable to keep from developing diabetes is not your fault.
Yes. That's right. So if that is something that you're blaming yourself for, definitely getting a little more education, recognizing that it's a very complex and multifactorial disease that is driven by a lot of things, but it is not your fault, first and foremost.
Right.
Jordan says the thing that she hates about diabetes is that she can't eat like the rest of her family and friends. And we hear that from lots of people. It's hard enough, just as you talked about, it's hard enough to change our eating habits, but it's even harder to have to negotiate that with family and then feel like we're different. What would you say to Jordan? What would you say to anybody who is saying, I don't want to feel left out and I don't want to have this argument with my family over and over again?
Right. Well, honestly, a diabetes-friendly way of eating is really how we should all be eating.
It's a healthy way of eating.
It's a healthy way of eating. Now, this is a complicated issue, but at the end of the day, you could eat whatever you want. And so what's important is that you make a choice. So you could eat that cake or pasta or the pizza. You need to decide when that's healthy for you as an individual. So I think, sort of the can'ts and the shouldn'ts, to be really careful with that, because you're making a choice and to feel empowered with your choices. So for example, if you're going to a party and it's going to be loaded with carbohydrates, that you plan for that a little bit. Is this maybe this is a party that you actually want to plan for and have some have a diabetes excursion there? So you're gonna go ahead and have some more carbs than you normally would.
Mm-hmm.
So you plan ahead for that. So that day maybe you follow a fairly low carb early in the day, and then afterwards, after you have the carbs, you make sure you take, if you're on insulin, you make sure you're taking the right amount, or if you aren't on insulin, then perhaps you take a walk afterwards. But you can plan for it. Another strategy for eating with your family or friends, if it's a higher carb food, is a smaller portion.
Absolutely.
Some people have found that they don't feel deprived if they just, like, for example, have a tablespoon of mashed potatoes instead of a half a cup. But that doesn't work for everybody. Some people say, Susan, I know I'm kind of an all or nothing thinker, and one piece of candy is not going to be it for me, and I'll end up eating the whole bag, the whole thing. So you kind of have to know yourself. But
Exactly.
But again, I really like to think about food choices as a trade rather than can't, don't,
or shouldn't. Yeah,
Yeah.
those are tough words.
Yeah.
One of my favorite members of our Facebook group, Jane Knoll, and Cindy Lou does this as well. When she knows she's going to a party, she just gets a little bit of everything, and so she doesn't feel deprived. She's getting a couple bites, and so it's like she doesn't have that deprivation feeling, which I know is really tough for people. So,
Yeah.
but as you said, that works for some people, not for others. You kind of have to figure out for yourself what's right.
Right. And again, think of it as a trade. So you might be trading feeling part, but what you're not trading then is the high blood glucose or the excess weight or the
Exactly.
so to think about it more as a trade
and a
choice.
And a choice that you're making.
Yeah.
Like, okay, I'm making
Right.
the choice here. And I do want to put a plug in here. Our dietitian, Melinda, talks about the 80-20 rule of eating. And I think it's so important to not fall into that trap of all or nothing, where it's like, I'm going to eat perfectly or I'm going to be completely off my eating plan, but finding a way to kind of put in places for snacks or treats every so often that, so you don't feel that feeling of deprivation. So I'm going to
Right.
pause for a moment here. Hang on just 1 second. I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to get a copy of our awesome snack guide. So I'm going to ask that trivia question one more time. True or false, dogs and cats can get diabetes? Is that true or false? Leave an answer for us in the comments and you will get that awesome snack guide. So Susan, we know that living with diabetes for a while can take a toll, and many physicians or psychologists like yourself call this diabetes distress, and you're really an expert on diabetes distress. Lisa Marie in our group says, I've lived more years of my life as a person with diabetes than not, and I am so burned out. Not being free and able to do what I want to do, always having to, quote, take care. So for people out there who are just so tired of having to deal with diabetes, what should they know?
Well, I always start my diabetes burnout talk with just putting it in perspective. So diabetes is that full-time job that you didn't want and you can't quit, and the pay stinks. And so it's no wonder that over a period of time, and you don't have to have diabetes for a lot of years to start feeling the experience of burnout. Again, diabetes can be a thankless job. A lot of times others it doesn't even occur to them to support you with your diabetes because they don't have any idea how much work is involved.
And what goes into it.
In fact, one of our colleagues sat in a standard diabetes education class, and she counted the number of behaviors that people were being asked to change. So that's things like, learn about the content of your food, how to count carbohydrates, take your medication on time and the right dosages at the same time every day, check your feet, learn how to check your blood glucose.
There's just so much.
Check your feet.
Yeah.
So she counted them as individual behaviors, and she quit counting at 150 separate behaviors.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
And so no wonder you feel overwhelmed and burned out.
Right.
And if you think about it, just in terms of human behavior, when we're doing a job, we'd like a pay, right? So when you're doing hard work, you'd like some kind of payoff at the end. And diabetes is a setup for that, for a couple of things. So if you think about why are you doing all of this hard work, it's so that nothing happens, right? And so when you think about nothing happening as a reward for all of this hard work, it makes sense that people would want to quit that job. And then besides, the elements of diabetes can make it even harder because if you are working really hard and you're getting frustrating numbers, or the elements of diabetes are sneaky because having elevated A1C, blood pressure, LDL cholesterol, those things that make diabetes that can jeopardize your health, well, those things don't hurt.
Right.
And so people can get used to remarkably high blood glucose levels. And so that if it doesn't hurt, it doesn't call you to take action.
Right.
And so that makes it sort of easy to get the I quits too, because when you're working hard, you don't feel any better. And when you kind of maybe back burner diabetes, it doesn't particularly hurt. And so having ways to keep motivated often have to do with focusing on what really matters, having some accountability, knowing your numbers, but not so much getting lost in your daily numbers, but we call them the smoke alarms, the A1C, blood pressure, LDL cholesterol, kind of knowing where you are at with those, and working towards safer.
Working towards safer. Okay, so I hear you say a couple things. As always, we're gonna focus on the 5 numbers: A1C, blood pressure, LDL cholesterol, EGFR, and an eye exam, making sure those numbers are as close to target as they can be, or as you say, safer, but working with your doctor to kind of know where you stand and know where you're focused. So that's part of dealing with diabetes burnout, is knowing, here's where I am. I kind of have a general direction. That helps people feel a little bit more, I don't want to say in control, but in the driver's seat a little bit. Talk about those 2 other things you were saying when it comes to combating, focusing on kind of the big picture. Tell us more about how people can avoid those feelings of just, this is just too much.
Well, I think that one thing is keeping it in perspective. So just to know, you're not alone, that most people struggle with diabetes management.
Yes.
And in fact, only about, in our latest large scale study where we looked at large numbers of people who have diabetes to see how many of them have all 3, A1C, blood pressure, LDL cholesterol. So not your 5, but those 3 in target. It was only about 25%. And so that's, 75% of people do not have their numbers at what would be considered target.
Right. So you are not alone. Like,
you're
yes.
not you're
Yes.
not alone. And in fact, if you have type 1 diabetes, those numbers are even lower because A1C is harder to get to target
Right.
with type 1 diabetes.
Right.
And so knowing you're not alone, just because a lot of times when you're struggling with diabetes and your numbers are elevated, you can feel like you're the only one and that somehow you're bad, or you're a failure, not
Right.
good at diabetes, which is a really key and common component of diabetes distress. But I think one thing that people don't get enough of, and I think this is probably one of the most important things if you have diabetes burnout, is again to not only know you're not alone, but that what you do actually matters, even though it may not feel like it. So, again, that idea is safer.
Yes.
But then another concept that I really try to help people learn is it relates to a message of hope. That actually, we have good data now that proves you don't have to be perfect to have well-managed diabetes. And so that, that working at what we call a healthy good enough goal.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you can't do all of the job of diabetes because you're burned out, and really nobody can do all of those 150 tests.
Right.
To pick the ones that are most important for you, and work towards a healthy, good enough goal.
So I want to pause you there for a second, because last year we spoke with Adam Brown, and he talked about, when we look at our meter, like our log, or we look at our CGM readout, it's so tempting to focus on the couple of numbers that weren't in range, rather than looking at all the things that were really good and that were really, that we did well. And that's true of a food journal. It's true of so many things in life. And so what I hear you saying is, 1, recognize that the choices you make really do matter, even if those numbers aren't necessarily where you want them to be. Focusing on kind of the habits and the process rather than the end result is important. But 2, to kind of resist that negativity bias of our brain and really focus on, I am doing these things well. Am I interpreting you correctly?
Yeah, and we have a lot of data to show that even some health behaviors are better than 0, and in terms of outcomes. So, to get lost in where you made a mistake, or the parts of your your diabetes, all of your diabetes numbers together, where you feel like you're not at goal. It can, not to get lost in that, because I haven't met anybody that doesn't at least have some areas of strength and some places where they're doing relatively well.
Yes. So focusing on that and building on that rather than the things that we're not happy about. I will also say one thing we've really seen in our Facebook group is the importance of community and the importance of surrounding yourself with other people who are dealing with the same issues that you are, who can encourage you, who can hold you accountable. Have you seen in your work that the more people can be connected to other people, that's helpful to them?
I really believe that's the secret ingredient to any program that we do that's a group-based program, is that while we hope that they benefit from the content that we're able to give them, really the secret ingredient to a group is the magic that happens when you experience a connection with another person who gets it.
Yes.
And that's from what I've observed in the 20 years I've been doing this, is that feeling not alone, understood that there's other people who can champion your efforts, that understand that that struggling with diabetes is normal, and that is like transformative for many people.
Like the magic sauce.
Yeah, it really is.
So Cheryl says the thing that frustrates her about diabetes is that she has depression. And she says a lot of depression medications can raise sugar levels, and it keeps me from wanting to go back on anything. So first, is that a misconception that antidepressant medications can raise blood sugar levels?
Well, we have mixed information on antidepressant medications and their effectiveness with or how they may impact blood glucose.
Mm-hmm.
But I just want to make sure that I say out loud that I'm a psychologist and not a psychiatrist. So obviously I'd rather defer, any specific questions, to ask to your medical doctor.
Absolutely. And also, I will interject here and say this is just diabetes information. You always want to talk to your doctor, your diabetes educator about anything related to your care. We're just providing general information.
Right.
So with that caveat, take it away, Susan.
So in general, antidepressants are considered safe for people with diabetes. Now, individuals may have individual reactions, and if you look at the labels that come with antidepressant medications, you sometimes will actually see the warning of hypoglycemia. Although I have to tell you, in working in this area for 20 years, I have never seen that be a problem for people on antidepressant, but it is in the labels. The most common type of antidepressant that's prescribed is called an SSRI. That's like Prozac, Lexapro, and Celexa, things like that. That's considered safe for people with diabetes. But again, an individual may have a reaction to a specific medication, but we don't really know why. And we don't actually even know why some antidepressants work for some people and not others. And another really important fact to know about antidepressants, just sort of in general, is that 50% of the time, the first one you try won't work.
Wow. Okay.
So it does require a certain amount of persistence.
Okay.
And unfortunately, the side effects kick in right away. The effects take 4 to 6 weeks. So it really is a commitment to start on an antidepressant medication. But what we've also seen is that the treatments for depression don't necessarily have to involve medication, but the standard of care for being on an antidepressant, like, we always highly recommend one if you have a moderate to severe level of depression. It's often a key component for actually breaking free from depression is antidepressant treatment. But if you don't have a moderate to severe level, you may be able to just as equally benefit from some form of psychotherapy. That's talking to someone like me, or a support group, or physical activity. Actually, it's one of the hardest things to do when you actually have depression.
Has a huge benefit.
It has a huge benefit, but people will often say, with depression, my get up and go is got up and went. And so forcing yourself to do exercise when you have depression is actually quite challenging, but it has huge antidepressive effects.
So I think the bottom line here, what I hear you saying is, if you think you might be depressed, understand if you are, and then seek treatment, whatever that might be. Whether it doesn't have to be medication, it could be trying to get a little more activity, it could be talking to a psychologist, but that does then have good impact on diabetes care as well, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So in treating depression is important when you have diabetes. Beyond the fact that depression stinks,
yes.
It really affects your life.
Yes.
But in addition, one of my patients described it like this. He says, Susan, when I have depression, it's like my give a damn is broken. And he says, when your give a damn is broken, it's pretty hard to care about how many carbs you ate and checking your blood glucose and even what your A1C is. And so it makes those self-care, the tasks, the
So
job.
much harder.
Diabetes. Yes, so much harder.
So managing depression, getting the help that you need is just going to make so many other aspects of your health easier, is what I hear you saying.
It removes that important barrier anyway.
Wow, Susan, this has been a jam-packed show with so much good information from you. Before we go, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us and being a part of this. You've really given us so much good information, so thank you.
Thank you.
So here is the answer to tonight's trivia question. It is indeed true that dogs and cats can develop diabetes. So even if you haven't answered it, leave a comment for us. Tell us what you thought of tonight's show, and you will get that guide to low-carb snacks. We will be back for our next episode on April 14th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Hope you'll be able to join us. Until then, thanks for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next time. Take care.